Mark drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring through his windshield. He couldn't go home, not yet. Every corner of the house was steeped in memories that now felt tainted. The thought of Karen's tearful face only deepened the ache in his chest, a bitter mixture of anger and sorrow. He parked by the waterfront, the dark expanse of water mirroring his own inner turmoil. Sitting there, he began to replay their years together. He remembered their first date, how Karen had laughed at his awkward attempts to impress her. He remembered the nights they'd spent dreaming about the future, making promises they both believed they'd keep. And yet, there had always been a part of Karen he could never reach. He saw it now, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, like the way she would withdraw after an argument, or the hesitance in her smile when he spoke of their future. He had chalked it up to the stresses of life, never once imagining it was something deeper. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a text from Karen. "Please come home. We need to talk more. I'll answer anything, I owe you that." Mark stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He wanted answers, but he wasn't sure if he could stomach the truth. What if her reasons cut deeper than he already knew? Instead of replying, he opened his call log and dialed a number he hadn't used in years, his best friend, James. They had drifted apart over time, mostly because Mark had poured himself into his marriage, neglecting other relationships. But now, he needed someone who knew him before all of this, someone who could help him make sense of the wreckage. "Mark?" James's voice was groggy but concerned. "It's late, man. Everything okay?" "No," Mark said, his voice breaking. "Not even close." Within 30 minutes, Mark was sitting in James's living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. James listened patiently as Mark spilled everything: the letter, the investigator, the confrontation. By the time he finished, Mark felt hollow, as though he had poured out every ounce of himself. James leaned back, his brow furrowed. "Man, I don't even know what to say. That's heavy. But let me ask you something. Do you think this was always about her? Or is there something you've been ignoring about yourself?" Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" James sipped his drink thoughtfully. "I'm not saying this is your fault, but you've always had this way of burying things, of avoiding the hard conversations. You focus on being dependable, on holding everything together, but maybe that's part of the problem. Did you ever ask Karen what she really needed from you?" Mark bristled at the suggestion. "She had everything I could give her. But was it what she wanted?" James pressed. "Look, I'm not excusing what she did. Cheating is unforgivable. But maybe you've been so focused on being enough that you missed what she was actually asking for." The words stung because they held a kernel of truth. Mark had always prided himself on being the reliable one, the steady hand in the chaos. But he had never been good at vulnerability, at opening himself up to the messy, uncomfortable parts of love. James leaned forward, his expression serious. "You need to decide what you want, Mark. Do you want answers, closure, revenge? Or do you want to try and fix this, even if it feels impossible? Because sitting here drinking isn't going to get you any of those." Mark left James's house in the early hours of the morning, his mind a tangle of conflicting emotions. He didn't know if Karen's betrayal could ever be forgiven, but he also didn't know if he was ready to walk away from 17 years of love and pain. As he drove home, a single thought loomed in his mind: he needed to hear the whole truth, no matter how much it hurt. Only then could he decide if their marriage was worth saving, or if it was already too late. When Mark returned home, the house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Karen was sitting at the dining table, her face pale and drawn, eyes rimmed red. She had clearly been crying, but as she looked up at him, her gaze held a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "You came back," she said softly. Mark nodded, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit but stood a few feet away, his arms crossed. "I want answers, Karen. All of them. No more deflections, no more lies. If there's any hope for us, if there ever was, I need to know everything." Karen swallowed hard, her hands clutching the edge of the table. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, as if a dam had burst, the words began to pour out. "It started earlier than you think," she admitted. "I met Daniel about 3 years into our marriage. I was feeling lost. Trapped, maybe. You were always so good to me, Mark, but I started questioning if I had made the right choice, if I had rushed into something I wasn't ready for." Mark's stomach churned, but he kept his expression stoic. "And Daniel was the answer to that?" "No," Karen said quickly. "At first, he was just someone who listened, someone who made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I thought it was harmless, a friendship. But it wasn't harmless, and I should have stopped it before it got out of hand." "And yet you didn't," Mark said, his voice cold. "You let it go on for 17 years. Karen flinched at the harshness of his tone but didn't argue. "You're right. I did. And I've hated myself for it every day. But it wasn't just Daniel, Mark. It wasn't about him. It was about me. About the things I couldn't bring myself to tell you." Mark's chest tightened. "Then tell me now." Karen hesitated, her hands trembling. "I know how much you tried, Mark. How much you've always tried to be the perfect husband. But there were things missing between us, things I didn't know how to ask for. And it wasn't fair to you. I didn't even fully understand what I needed until it was too late." Mark's mind raced, her words cutting deeper than he expected. He had always thought he was enough. Maybe not flashy, maybe not the life of the party, but enough. Steady, reliable, loyal. Yet here Karen was, telling him he had failed in ways he hadn't even realized. "Why didn't you just leave me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "If I wasn't what you wanted, why didn't you walk away instead of doing this behind my back?" Karen's face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Because I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. "I still love you, Mark. I never stopped. And I was terrified of losing the life we built together. I told myself I could keep both worlds separate, that I could make it work somehow. But I was wrong." Mark shook his head, his hands gripping the back of a chair for support. "You didn't just hurt me, Karen. You destroyed me. Every time you smiled at me, every time you said you loved me, it was a lie. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" Karen stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've broken something that can never be fixed. But I'm here, Mark. I'm here, and I'll tell you anything you want to know, no matter how painful it is." Mark stared at her, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite name. He wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out. But more than anything, he wanted to understand. To make sense of the 17 years he had spent living a lie. "Start from the beginning," he said finally, his voice a mixture of resignation and determination. "Tell me everything. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Karen nodded, wiping her tears. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll tell you everything." And so she began. As Karen unraveled the years of deception, Mark braced himself for truths that would shatter the foundation of their marriage. He didn't know if he could survive it, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't live in the dark anymore. Karen's words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, but as the minutes turned into hours, the story of her betrayal unfolded with unrelenting clarity. Mark sat across from her, his face expressionless, his fingers drumming softly against the table as he listened. "I met Daniel at a work event," she began, her voice shaky. "You remember that fundraiser I went to years ago? You couldn't come because of a late shift. He was there. We got to talking and I don't know how to explain it. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time." Mark's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "It wasn't physical at first," she said quickly, as if that would soften the blow. "We'd talk, text, meet up for coffee. He'd ask me questions about my dreams, my fears, things I hadn't even thought about in years. I started looking forward to our conversations in a way that scared me. And then, one night..." She trailed off, unable to finish. "You crossed the line," Mark said, his voice cold and steady. The line you promised to honor when we said our vows. Karen flinched but nodded. Yes. She went on to describe how their relationship had evolved, how it had gone from secret lunches to overnight trips, how she had justified each decision by convincing herself that Mark didn't need to know. I told myself it didn't mean I loved you any less, she said. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Mark couldn't stop himself from interrupting. And the others? He asked, his voice rising. Because Daniel wasn't the only one, was he? Karen's face crumpled with shame. No, she admitted. There were others. But they didn't mean anything. They were fleeting. I didn't even know what I was looking for. And Daniel? Mark pressed. What about him? Did he mean anything? Karen hesitated, and that pause spoke louder than any words. Finally, she whispered, Yes. Mark's hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. So what was I, Karen? A safety net? A placeholder? No, Karen said, her voice cracking. You were my rock, Mark. You were the one thing in my life I could count on. But She stopped, choking on her words. You what? Mark demanded. Say it. Whatever excuse you're about to make, just say it. I felt unfulfilled, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It wasn't your fault, Mark. You did everything right. But there were things I needed that I didn't know how to ask for. And by the time I realized that, I was already too far gone. Mark stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He turned away from her, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. Unfulfilled, he repeated bitterly. That's what 17 years of loyalty and love get me. You felt unfulfilled. Karen stood as well, her tears streaming freely now. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, she said. But you have to believe me when I say I never stopped loving you. I was selfish, Mark. I was weak. But I never wanted to lose you. Mark spun around to face her, his eyes blazing. You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you, Karen. The moment you turned to someone else instead of coming to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood frozen, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, while Mark stared at her, his heart breaking under the weight of her confession. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I need to leave. I can't look at you right now. Mark, please, Karen said, reaching out to him, but he pulled away. Don't, he said sharply. I need time. I need space. And when I come back, if I come back, you'd better have a damn good reason why I should stay. Without another word, Mark grabbed his keys and walked out the door. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating tension inside the house. As he drove aimlessly through the city once again, one question echoed in his mind: could he ever forgive her? Or was this the end of everything they had built together? Mark didn't go far. He found himself parked outside a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place he and Karen had gone to often in the early days of their marriage. Back then, they'd spend hours in one of the red vinyl booths, dreaming about the future and making promises that now felt like distant echoes of another life. He stepped inside, the scent of coffee and fried food wrapping around him like an old blanket. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, gave him a sympathetic smile as she led him to a booth in the corner. Mark didn't even glance at the menu. Just coffee, he said. Black. As he sat there, staring into the steaming mug, his mind churned with memories, regrets, and the cold, hard truths Karen had laid bare. She had loved him, she claimed. But what did that love mean when it was tangled up in years of betrayal? For a brief moment, he entertained the idea of calling James again. But what was there left to say? James had already given him the hard truth. If he wanted closure, if he wanted to move forward, he needed to decide what he wanted. Yet every time Mark tried to envision a future without Karen, he felt like he was losing a part of himself. He thought about their daughters, teenagers now, both smart and vibrant. What would they think if they knew? Could he even bring himself to tell them? And then there was the house, the life they had built together. Everything he had worked so hard to protect was crumbling beneath him. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Karen. "Mark, I know I've lost your trust, but I'm begging you to come home. We need to figure this out together, for us, for the girls. Please." He stared at the message, his emotions swirling. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let her sit in the wreckage she had created. But another part of him, the part that had loved her unconditionally for so many years, felt the pull of her words. He typed a response, his fingers hesitating over the keys. "I'll come back, but not tonight. I need time to think." Her reply came almost immediately. "Take as much time as you need. I'm not going anywhere." Mark let out a bitter laugh. The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. She might not be going anywhere now, but she had spent years going everywhere else. The next morning, Mark found himself at the private investigator's office. He hadn't planned on coming, but there was one nagging question he couldn't shake. Why had the anonymous letter come now? Someone had known about Karen's affair, maybe even before he did. Someone had decided it was time for the truth to come out. The investigator, a no-nonsense man named Harris, leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's not uncommon," Harris said. "Sometimes it's a jilted lover, someone close to the affair. Or maybe it's someone who just got tired of watching the lies." "Do you think it was Daniel?" Mark asked. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. Harris shrugged. "Could be. Affairs like this don't usually end cleanly. Or it could be someone from Karen's side, a friend, a co-worker. Someone who knew and couldn't live with the secret." Mark mulled over the possibilities. If it was Daniel, that meant the relationship between him and Karen had soured enough for him to expose her. If it was someone else, it meant there were more eyes on their life than he'd ever realized. "Can you find out who sent it?" Mark asked. Harris nodded. "It'll take some digging, but I can try." As Mark left the office, he felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Whoever had sent that letter had ripped open his life, but they might also hold the key to understanding why it all fell apart. For now, though, he had to decide what to do with the pieces. The days stretched on in an agonizing blur. Mark avoided Karen, spending his time at work or taking long drives through the countryside. The pain of her betrayal felt like a weight strapped to his chest, making it hard to breathe. Yet despite the ache, a part of him clung to the faint hope that the answers he sought might help him make sense of it all. A week after his visit to the investigator, Harris called with an update. "I've got something," he said. "You're going to want to come in for this." Mark drove to Harris's office, his heart pounding. The manila folder waiting on Harris's desk felt heavier than it looked, as though it contained not just information but the final verdict on his marriage. Harris wasted no time. "The letter came from a man named Carl Thompson," he said. "He's a co-worker of Karen's. Or, more accurately, her former co-worker." Mark frowned. "Why would a co-worker send me something like that?" "That's where things get interesting," Harris said, leaning forward. "Carl and Karen had an involvement. A brief one. Looks like it happened about 8 years ago, shortly after one of her trips with Daniel." Mark's head spun. Another name. Another betrayal. "So what? He wanted revenge?" Harris nodded. "It seems that way. I reached out to him, and he didn't hold back. He said Karen ended things with him abruptly and went back to Daniel. According to Carl, he felt used, like he was just a distraction until she could get back to her real affair. He sat on this for years, but something must have pushed him over the edge recently." Mark sat back, trying to process it all. Karen's lies had spun a web so wide, it seemed to entangle everyone around her. "Did Carl say anything else?" Harris hesitated. "He did. He said he wasn't the only one who knew about Karen's relationship with Daniel. Apparently, a few of her colleagues suspected something over the years. They saw her sneaking around, taking long lunches, and getting defensive when asked about her trips." The revelation stung more than Mark expected. He had always thought of himself as Karen's closest confidant, the one person who truly knew her. But now, it seemed like half her office had been privy to secrets he had been blind to. "Does Carl still have contact with Karen?" Mark asked. "No," Harris said. "They haven't spoken in years. But he said something that might interest you. He claimed Karen once told him she had considered leaving you for Daniel but decided against it because, her words, not mine, it would be too messy." Mark felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. She hadn't stayed out of love or loyalty. She had stayed out of convenience. He stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. "Thanks, Harris," he said, his voice tight. "Send me the report." As Mark drove home, Carl's words echoed in his mind. Karen's choices hadn't been impulsive or reckless. They had been calculated, deliberate. She had weighed her options and chosen the path that benefited her the most, regardless of the cost to him. When he pulled into the driveway, Karen was waiting for him on the porch, her face etched with worry. He hadn't told her where he was going or what he was doing, but she had been watching him closely since the confrontation. "Mark," she said as he stepped out of the car. "We need to talk." "No," Mark said, his voice firm. "I need to talk. You need to listen." Karen's eyes widened, but she nodded, stepping aside to let him inside. Mark sat at the dining table, the same place where they had faced each other a week ago. Karen sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I know about Carl," Mark said, his voice cold and steady. "And I know why he sent the letter." Karen's face went pale, her lips parting in silent shock. She didn't deny it, didn't try to explain. Instead, she looked down, her shoulders sagging. "I want to know one thing," Mark said. "If Daniel had asked you to leave me, would you have done it?" Karen looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mark, answer the question," he demanded. She hesitated, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know." Her words hit him like a physical blow. After everything, after all the lies and betrayals, she still couldn't give him the truth. Mark stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't do this anymore, Karen. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you. But right now I need space. I need to figure out if there's anything left to salvage." Karen's sobs followed him as he walked out the door, but Mark didn't look back. For the first time in years, he was stepping away from the wreckage of their marriage, unsure if he'd ever return. Mark didn't return that night. He checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town, its plain, uninspiring decor a perfect match for his mood. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. It gave him space to think, a dangerous proposition given the storm of emotions inside him. Lying on the stiff mattress, Mark stared at the ceiling, the weight of Karen's admission crushing him. "I don't know." Her answer had been honest, and yet it felt like the cruelest lie. If she didn't know whether she would have left him for Daniel, what did that say about the life they had built together? Was he nothing more than a backup plan, a safety net for when her other escapades fell apart? Sleep was impossible, so Mark pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos of their family. There they were on vacation at the beach, the girls building sandcastles while Karen laughed beside them. Another shot of a backyard barbecue, Mark holding a spatula and grinning while Karen leaned against him. In every image, they looked like the perfect couple. But now those memories felt hollow, the smiles forced under the weight of secrets he hadn't known were there. By morning, Mark felt no closer to clarity. He checked out of the motel and drove to a nearby park, needing the fresh air to clear his head. As he walked the winding paths, he replayed Harris's revelations about Carl. The thought of Karen entangling herself with yet another man made him physically ill. And yet, what haunted him most was the realization that he didn't know her anymore. Or perhaps he never had. He returned to the investigator's report later that day, poring over the details of Karen's relationship with Daniel. One entry stood out to him, a record of a private message exchange between Daniel and Karen. Harris had obtained it through what he called discreet methods. Mark hadn't been ready to read it before, but now, curiosity overpowered his hesitation. The conversation began innocently, with Daniel asking Karen about her day. But as Mark scrolled further, the tone shifted. Daniel, I don't know how you live two lives like this. Doesn't it wear on you? Karen, sometimes, yes. But I can't give it up, Daniel. I can't give you up. Daniel. And Mark? What about him? Karen. Mark is my stability. He's a good man. He doesn't deserve this, but I don't know how to leave him without tearing everything apart. Mark read those words over and over, each time feeling the sting of betrayal anew. Stability. A good man. She had compartmentalized him, reducing him to a role rather than a person. And yet she had also admitted guilt, a flicker of humanity amidst the cold pragmatism of her double life. Closing the report, Mark leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spinning. Karen's words confirmed what he had feared most: she had stayed with him not out of love, but out of convenience. And Daniel, for all his charm, hadn't been enough to pull her away. She had wanted both worlds, and for 17 years she had succeeded. But the house of cards had finally fallen. That evening, Mark returned to the house. Karen was in the kitchen, her face lighting up with a mix of hope and fear when she saw him. "You're back," she said cautiously. "For now," Mark replied. "We need to talk. Again." Karen nodded, setting aside the dish she had been washing. They sat at the dining table, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "I read the investigator's report," Mark began. "I saw your messages with Daniel." Karen's face paled, but she didn't interrupt. "You told him I was your stability. That I didn't deserve this." Mark's voice cracked as he spoke. "If you knew I didn't deserve it, why did you keep doing it?" Karen's hands trembled in her lap. "I don't have a good answer, Mark. I was selfish. I wanted it all, the comfort of our life together, and the thrill of something forbidden. I told myself I could balance both, but I was wrong." Mark leaned forward, his voice low and raw. "You didn't just gamble with your happiness, Karen. You gambled with mine, with the lives of our daughters, with everything we built. And for what? A man who didn't even love you enough to ask you to stay?" Karen flinched at his words, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I'm begging you, Mark, please don't let this be the end of us. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Mark stared at her, his heart torn between the woman he had loved for nearly 2 decades and the stranger who had lived a life he never knew. "Making this right might not be possible," he said quietly. "But I'll give you one chance to convince me otherwise." Karen nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'll fight for us, Mark. I promise." As Mark walked upstairs to the guest room, where he would be sleeping that night, he felt no relief. Karen's promises were just words, and words were what had gotten them into this mess. If she wanted to save their marriage, she would need to prove it with actions. And even then, Mark wasn't sure if it would be enough. The days that followed were strained, marked by silence and the occasional stilted conversation. Mark kept his distance, watching Karen with guarded eyes as she tried to piece their shattered life back together. She canceled her work commitments, claiming she needed time to focus on their family. She started cooking meals, cleaning the house, even leaving little notes for Mark in places he'd find them, on his nightstand, in his car, tucked into his laptop bag. Each note was a plea for forgiveness. "I'm sorry. I love you. Please don't give up on us." But for Mark, they felt hollow, like apologies scrawled in sand before the tide washed them away. He wanted to believe her sincerity, but trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily. One evening, Karen approached him hesitantly. "Mark," she said, her voice soft, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should go to counseling. Together." Mark arched an eyebrow. "Counseling?" "Yes," Karen said quickly. "I know I have a lot to answer for, but I think we need someone to help us navigate this. To figure out if we can rebuild what we had." Mark considered her words. He hated the idea of airing their dirty laundry to a stranger, but perhaps it was the only way forward. He nodded reluctantly. Fine. Set it up. Their first session was awkward, to say the least. The therapist, a calm, middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellison, invited them to share their thoughts, but the tension between them was palpable. Karen spoke first, her voice trembling as she recounted her mistakes, her regrets, her desire to fix what she had broken. I know I've hurt Mark in ways I can never undo, she said, clutching a tissue. But I still love him. I always have. Dr. Ellison turned to Mark. How do you feel about that, Mark? Mark sighed, leaning back in his chair. I feel conflicted. Angry. Betrayed. I want to believe her, but I don't know if I can. And honestly, I don't know if I should. Dr. Ellison nodded. Those feelings are valid. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and when it's broken, it takes time and effort to rebuild. The question is, are you both willing to do the work? Karen nodded emphatically. I'll do whatever it takes. Mark hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I'll try, he said finally. But I'm not making any promises. Over the next few weeks, they continued their sessions, unpacking years of buried resentment and unspoken truths. Karen admitted that she had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy, of not being enough despite outward appearances of confidence. Mark confessed that he had often prioritized being dependable over being emotionally available, retreating into himself when things became difficult. For the first time in years, they began to speak honestly, without deflection or pretense. But the process was grueling, and every step forward seemed to bring fresh pain. One night, after a particularly emotional session, Karen sat beside Mark on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. There's something I haven't told you, she said quietly. Mark tensed. What now? It's about Daniel, she said. The last time I saw him, he asked me to leave you. To run away with him. Mark's chest tightened. And? I said no, Karen said, tears filling her eyes. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't bear to hurt you like that. I thought if I stayed, I could fix things. That I could have the best of both worlds. But I see now that staying wasn't enough. It was just another betrayal. Mark stared at her, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger and sorrow. Do you think that makes it better? He asked, his voice low. That you stayed out of guilt instead of love? Karen shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. No. It doesn't make it better. But it's the truth. Mark leaned back, closing his eyes. Her honesty was a double-edged sword, painful, but necessary. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to see her clearly, stripped of all illusions. Then we'll start with the truth, he said finally, and see where it takes us. Karen nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Whether they could rebuild their marriage remained uncertain, but for now, they had taken the first step towards something, what either of them could yet say. Months passed, and though the wounds remained raw, the air between Mark and Karen began to shift. Their therapy sessions became less about excavating old pain and more about understanding how they had arrived at this fractured place. For every answer Karen gave, Mark found new questions, but at least now, he was asking them aloud instead of letting them fester in silence. Karen was relentless in her efforts to prove herself. She handed over access to her phone, her email, and even her financial records, promising full transparency. She cut ties with anyone who had been part of her double life, including Daniel. But Mark knew trust wasn't something she could hand him on a silver platter. It had to be earned slowly, piece by piece. One day, Mark stood at the threshold of their bedroom, watching Karen fold laundry. She looked up and smiled, a smile that was tentative, unsure, and utterly unlike the confident grin she used to wear. What? She asked, her voice soft. Nothing, Mark said, stepping inside. He sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to put his thoughts into words. I've been thinking a lot about us. Karen nodded, setting down the shirt she'd been folding. And I'm still not sure where we go from here. he admitted. Some days I feel like we're making progress. Other days it feels like there's too much damage to fix. Karen's eyes glistened, but she didn't interrupt. She had learned to let him speak, to give him the space he needed to process. I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely, Mark continued. But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up on us. Not yet. Karen reached out, her hand hovering near his before pulling back. Mark, I know I don't deserve a second chance. But if you give me one, if you give us one, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of it. Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Mark studied her face, searching for the cracks in her resolve, but for once, there were none. Karen was bearing herself completely, without pretense or deflection. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll try. But this time, we do it together. Karen's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Thank you, Mark. Over the next year, they worked tirelessly to rebuild their marriage. It wasn't easy. The ghost of Karen's betrayal lingered like a shadow, and Mark often found himself questioning her motives, her actions, even her words. But each time he felt doubt creeping in, Karen faced it head-on, answering his questions with unwavering honesty. Their daughters noticed the change in the household. Though Mark and Karen never told them the full truth, the girls saw their parents talking more, laughing more, and even arguing more openly, a far cry from the tense silences that had once defined their home. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Karen reached for Mark's hand. Do you think we'll ever be okay again? She asked. Mark considered her question for a long moment. I think we'll be different, he said. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we needed to break to figure out how to be stronger. Karen nodded, her fingers tightening around his. Different is okay, she said. As long as we're still us. Mark didn't reply, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a glimmer of hope. Their journey was far from over, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for now, they were walking it together. And that, Mark realized, was a start. Bye-bye.